Be honest. Do you try to save whatever's left at the end of the month and somehow it's always zero? Yeah, same trap we all suffer. The fix is ridiculously simple. Pay yourself first. Today, I'll show you exactly how to use this fund to build up towards purchasing your first home, even if you've never saved a dollar on purpose. Welcome to the phenomenal Charlie Black Finance, Freedom, and the Mindset to Move. If this is your lane, please hit the subscribe button below, like, share, and comment. So here's your plan for today. Number one, what pay yourself actually means. Secondly, how to set it up in 15 minutes. Third, exactly how much to start with and how to scale it. Number four, what accounts to use and which to avoid. Fifth, how to do this if your income is irregular. Sixth, what to do if you have debt. And lastly, a 90-day action plan that you can implement tonight, plus a few real life examples. So this isn't purely theory. So, first, what does pay yourself mean? Well, if you treat your savings like a bill, rent gets paid, utilities get paid, you get paid. Money moves to savings before you touch it, like taxes, for example, which brings us to something important: net versus gross income. Gross income is what you make before taxes. Net income is what you make after taxes and benefits depending on your job. This is the check that hits your account. You will set your percentages based off your net, which also gives us fixed versus variable expenses. Fixed expenses are what you pay every month that's the same. Think rent, your car insurance, your car note, and variable would be something that changes monthly. Groceries, gas, utilities. Knowing the difference between these expenses help you realize exactly what you need to save. Why does this work? Well, unfortunately, we're human, so we don't necessarily have automation, but automation does remove the should I save debate. Also, you have what's called loss aversion flip. You'll be spending the savings if you skip the transfer, which means if you don't move the money before you start spending, you will likely spend it, what you were supposed to save. And of course, the dreadful lifestyle creep shield. When income rises, your automated savings should rise along with it, if you keep the percentage. Otherwise, you'll just be spending more and saving less. I do believe that people think they have a spending problem. Most of us have a timing problem. Move the money before the spending happens. So let's pick a savings target. Number one, as you've probably heard before, an emergency fund. That would be 1 to 3 months of essential expenses if you're starting out. And number two would be your first home fund. This would be the down payment, the starter closing cash, plus move in cushion. In other words, how much money would you need to close the deal, and how much would you need to be able to move in? Now, that would be another example, a sinking fund, a named bucket for a future expense. For example, a first home fund would be a sinking fund. It keeps money from getting mixed with our day to day cash flow. Now, we know the destination we want to go to, so now we need the vehicle to take us there. A high yield savings account for both buckets. Liquidity does matter. Liquidity, of course, being cash. Rate is a nice bonus, but don't chase the rate at the cost of reliability. And of course, separate funds or sub accounts to your checking account. This would, in my opinion, be best understood if you change the name to something like emergency cushion, first home fund, college fund, second car fund. It allows you to differentiate between money that's being saved for a purpose, money being saved in general, and money that you can use in case of emergency. So now we must automate the flow. So, first, what we can do is split the direct deposit. This means you can contact your HR department or your payroll clerk or whoever you use in your industry company or your own personal desire and send a percentage straight into each savings bucket. So you can allocate based on percentages how much money you're saving to which account and why. Or you can do a scheduled transfer. You can set automatic transfers, usually on your app or your bank's website, your credit union's website or app, to transfer on mornings after each payday when you get paid. For example, if you get paid every Friday, you can schedule the transfer for Saturday. If you get paid every Thursday, you can schedule it for Friday. So that way you know you have the money on hand to transfer. Or you can do something called a roundup add-on. This could be nice to have, but I wouldn't recommend using this as your main model. Treat it like sprinkles on an ice cream cone. All right. So now we have the formula. Choose your bucket, name you the account, automate the percentage. Don't worry about it in the future. I often also like to recommend to set the transfer time before you wake up or before you go shopping. That way, the money will just disappear from your checking account without you having to worry about things. It's already happened and you won't overspend. So, now the number one question that you would probably have that varies based off advisor to advisor or even the person saving. How much should you save? Well, I find it easier to save a percentage than a flat dollar amount. In other words, you can say, for as a baseline, I will save 10% of my net pay. However, when first starting, let's be a little bit more realistic and drop that 10% down to around 3 to 5%, especially if money is tight. But it allows you to build the habit. And from starting low, you can eventually pivot up a little bit higher. So 3 to 5% when you first start saving can actually go up 1% each month, especially as you have a better control of your variable expenses. However, if you're comfy, for example, you live with your parents or you're in a very comfortable financial situation, I would recommend 15 to 20%, even if your emergency fund is topped off. Why wait for just 1 to 3 months in case of emergency? Save up till you have a year, 2 years in case of emergency. You never know what can happen, especially something like paternity leave. You might not be working for several months. And even if you get paid, having more money accessible on hand is better than less. However, if your emergency fund is topped off on a level you would like or on a level that you're comfortable with, I would recommend shifting 10% to 15% towards the specific fund. For example, the first house fund. So let's give some quick math examples for people who are better understanding numbers with percentages than words with percentages. So, for example, let's say your net pay is $2,800 a month. 10% of that will go towards savings. Again, as a baseline, that would be $280 a month. Now, of course, at the high end, for people who have money being tight, if it was 5%, that would be $140 a month. But realistically, if you're able to save 10% of your net pay, you could have up to $3,360 a year saved. Now, over time, especially when young, that number can be very lucrative in the future. Or again, if money would be tight, you would just divide that by half. But let's say you have a better job now. You're climbing up in the world. So your net pay is $4,000 a month. So that makes you a little bit comfy, right? That could bring us to that coveted 15 to 20%. Now, 15% of 4,000 net is 600 a month. 20% would be 800 a month. Now the number is looking good. In fact, you could potentially triple, even though your net pay didn't triple, your savings could triple. Now 3360, just at 15%. Remember, you went from 10% with a lower pay to 15% with a higher pay. Now you shot up to $7,200 a year. But again, if you were capable of saving 20%, you see how the numbers start to rise. Now, of course, most people get paid bi-weekly or weekly. So let's say you're at $1,300 bi-weekly. So that's $650 a week. Net, of course. Now you save 10% of that. That's $130 saved every pay period, which again goes up to $3,380 a year, which would be allocated through 26 pay periods or 26 paychecks. And the number is still around the same as if you got paid 28 a month, as in 2,800, but it's just an idea of the numbers you can have based off the numbers you can make. Now, a rule of thumb for splitting your money while building both buckets would be first, learning financial discipline and learning where to put the first amounts of money. For example, the first $1,500 or $3,000 saved can go towards the emergency fund, which again is a fund established to be able to take care of 1 to 3 months of expenses if you ever lose your job or something happens and your income is limited. But after that, the first 15 to 3,000, you have that saved away now. So now 70% of your monthly savings can go towards your first house fund. Now 30% would still being allocated to the emergency fund until you hit the number you want. Again, that would be up to personal preference. Your monthly variable expenses can, that's why it's called variable, vary over time. You might have a summer where you have a lot of electricity that you must spend. But in the winter, you don't have that problem. Vice versa. Your electric bill might be higher in the winter than it is in the summer. It all depends on how your expenses are already established. But again, if you can lower them, that's always ideal. But of course, rent or mortgage, that is, of course, fixed. You're paying what you signed the contract, whether it's a lease agreement, whether it's a mortgage, you know how much you're going to pay and when it's due. But let's say as an essential expense, it could be, of course, utilities because you need to have power and water in order to survive. Basic groceries, so you know what foods you need, again, to be able to survive. Transportation, unless you're a remote worker and you're not necessarily needing to go places, especially while saving money for a few months. Minimum debt payments, which of course would be a personal issue depending on how much debt you have accumulated versus how much debt you've paid off. But of course, debt is still necessary. You may have credit card debt, school loans, any loans in general. You might owe somebody you know money. You might technically owe your company money if you took an advance. Those would be considered debt payments. And of course, insurance, whether it's health insurance, auto insurance, homeowners insurance, if you have a home. If you're buying your first home, you wouldn't necessarily have homeowners insurance, but you do need homeowners insurance in order to purchase a home. So it's still a good idea to set money aside and find out where you're going to be able to get the best possible premium or policy for you. However, there is something called DTI. That would be your debt to income ratio. Now, lenders look at this ratio to determine whether or not you will be qualified to receive, whether it's credit card, a loan, or anything of that nature. Of course, the lower the ratio is, which is the difference between something called debt to income and, of course, how much your profit margin would be, the lower your DTI, the better. And of course, the higher your income ratio, the better. However, your savings habit doesn't change your debt to income ratio, but it can prevent you from going into future debt. And it also helps you build cash to be able to make approvals smoother. Again, the lower your debt to income, the better the ratio is for companies that are lenders, usually banks, credit unions. All credit card companies come from some sort of bank. The lower your debt, the higher your chances of approval. And of course, if you ever get a nice glowing employee review, or based off of your contract, you do get annual raises, of course, any raise or if you make money on the side, I would say to take 50% of that increase and put it into your automated savings for 3 months before you change your lifestyle. That prevents you from backsliding because again, especially now with the whole no tax on overtime, the more overtime you work, you do have greater take home pay up to a limit. And keeping as much of that money as possible is better than thinking you need it for expenses because otherwise you're funding a lifestyle you can't properly maintain. Now, this brings us to the types of accounts and potential income friction. Now, what does this mean? Make sure you're not dipping into specific accounts just because you need money. In other words, do not touch the house fund until you're about to purchase a house. Use a separate bank, or at least don't look at the balance on the home man screen. See if you can get another bank that you don't necessarily use. For example, there are people who love Chase but would make their first home fund in Citibank, or they'll use a credit union that has a proven track history of funding mortgages. Always make sure the account that you're using for your first home fund is not an account you're constantly looking at. Don't even activate the debit card for that account until the time is coming for you to go towards that purchase. So, if it's not your first home fund, say it's your first car fund, you know how much you need for the first car. You can find out by talking to a car salesman, see how much you need, see how much the entire process will be, because they can bring all that paperwork to you until you sign and say, I'm buying the car. They always show you the numbers before the car is purchased. Or, same with a house. You look at the contract before you sign. Also, if you do have a Google Wallet, Samsung Wallet, I'm not too familiar with Apple, but I'm pretty sure there's an Apple Wallet. Don't even put that account in your Apple Wallet or your Google Wallet or Samsung Wallet. Keep that completely out of your mind. The friction would be if you look at bank accounts that you can touch and compare it to expenses you might want. Now, what does that mean? Well, it all depends on risk factor now. Let's say you have a bank, or whether it's a checking account, savings account, but you have a bank that says, we can do a mutual fund for you as a separate account. Well, to some people who are accepting that risk, you could technically put your first house fund, first car fund, your first major purchase fund into a mutual fund. Now, what does that mean? That means the bank will take that money and invest it for you. You can let the bank know what you want it to invest it in: grants, stocks, futures, securities. And what that does is it could potentially raise your money higher than a savings account, but it could also lose you money. So that's why it's a risk. Now, if you're comfortable with risk, then you can go forward that way. To those who are a little bit more conservative, then I would say to keep your house fund, again, big purchase fund, somewhere safe and liquid. In other words, pure cash. Don't tie up the money in a fund that you would need to then sell, and potentially that could take some more time than you want, and thus you would have to wait for money. And additionally, those would be considered capital gains, and you would have to pay taxes on that in the future, as opposed to savings. Now, if you have an IRA account, whether it's a normal IRA or Roth IRA, if you took that money that you have in the retirement account and you drained it for a down payment, unless you are considering again that dreaded tax, which generally is 30%, especially because those funds would be high, or you're willing to take a penalty, which you would then have to pay it back over time, it would be potentially trading long term pain for a short term benefit. Again, if you're young, you might feel that's fine. But remember, beautiful word called interest. So even though it doesn't seem so bad now, every month this could be accruing, especially if you don't read the fine print. Some interest accrues monthly, and it's that percentage new balance, and it goes every single month. That is why, hopefully, and usually, you're warned before you touch any of these accounts, especially if you want to purchase something like a house. It is much better to wait, potentially find a different place that you also might fall in love with, rather than make something like taking out from your investment or taking out from your retirement to pay for something now. Because, of course, money can only do one job at a time. It can either grow or it can be spent. Even if you're spending money, that's money again that's not being grown. So, again, if your house is your goal, let your house money work for you while you're working to pay for everything else. Now, of course, as previously mentioned, what if my income is irregular? What if I'm a 1099? That'd be an independent contractor. I drive for Uber or Uber Eats or DoorDash. I can make great money one day, not so much good money the next. What happens? Well, that's why you create something called a smoothing salary. Pick a conservative, meaning be realistic, monthly baseline that you can hit. So let's say in 30 days you can hit somewhere between 2,000 to 2,500. All the income from this, of course, irregular form of working should land in what's called a buffer account. On the 1st and 15th, think of it like rent or mortgage. You pay yourself a baseline from that buffer. Remember, if your income is irregular, there's a good chance you're either an independent contractor or you work for an app. Still, that would be considered independent contractor. You receive the tax form 1099. And again, setting aside 30% for taxes is necessary because you will be paying taxes. Even if you can do what they call writing off expenses, you still want to save 30% just in case. You don't want to lowball it. Overshooting taxes is better than lowballing. And always having a great accountant works as well. Now, of course, your saving percentage would be based on the baseline, not the buffer. And it happens again right after you pay yourself. Now, what happens on a good versus a bad month? Again, let's say your DoorDash account is amazing during the summer, starts to teeter off in the fall. More people are cooking on their own on the winter. So now your income is slightly deviating south, not north. Well, firstly, on good months, you want to top off the buffer first. In other words, you want to target 1 month of baseline. Again, that would be based off of a percentage you're comfortable with, not something that I can recommend to you. However, again, you throw some extra into that first house fund. But let's say you're on that dreaded bad month. If you're a contractor, you're not getting many people offering you contracts, or you're again on a slow part of the independent app purchases that people do. Well, that's why the buffer would cover the gap. Now, savings automation can drop to the minimum floor, like whatever you're comfortable with as minimum $20 per check. But you still want to be saving and building towards your purpose. You never want to break the habit, because once you break the habit, it's more difficult to come back to what am I supposed to save. Now, of course, again, if you're a freelancer, as I mentioned before, United States government takes usually 25 to 30% of income for taxes. And that's gross, not net. So again, if you're an independent contractor, you think I made $3,000, take 30% right off the bat. That net income is what you make. You didn't make 3,000. Now, if you spend that $3,000, you're gonna have to find a lucrative way to get more money back. But again, the more money you make, the more money they'll take. So 3,000 paying in taxes can actually a month. You need that 30% buffer. But again, that buffer also is for a specific reason. Fund expenses, variable fixed, taxes. Taxes have to come before even the variable expenses because tax is a major problem for people. You need to pay them. Of course, you can always find a cheaper place to live or a cheaper car or better deals for your even fixed expenses like food and groceries. But taxes are final. You have to pay them every year. You can also pay them every quarter. That's also an option. But now, what if you have debt? Well, there should be minimums you pay on debt that are non negotiable. And also, again, this goes back to the emergency fund, where if something were to happen to your income, you're able to cover these expenses, even if you have debt. Now, let's try to stay away from high interest debts like retail credit cards, especially. Anything that's 16 to 20% annual percentage rate, which would be the APR, while still paying yourself a tiny amount. Like, for example, you're paying 16 to 20% APR, but you can only save 1 to 3% because you're in debt. If you still pay that amount in savings, you're able to keep the habit alive. Now, once toxic credit card debt is gone, you can now increase your savings amount automatically and accelerate the funds you're looking for. As again, you're no longer paying 16 to 20% in interest, that amount can now be put towards the first house fund. So, you might have heard of terms like debt snowball and debt avalanche. Both have pros and cons. But what is the snowball? Well, you take your smallest balance first and pay it off because the snowball starts small and gets large. That would be motivating yourself to get out of certain debt. You're paying the small first and then tackling the large later. Now, the avalanche, again, what is an avalanche? An avalanche comes from the top down. That means the highest interest rate is paid off first. That would be a more logistic way to approach the problem. If you have a card that says something like 35 to 40% interest if you don't pay it off in 6 months, do everything you can to pay off that charge in the first 6 months. You don't want the seventh month because that seventh month is when the interest kicks in. But it still is ultimately your choice, and you would want to pick one and stick with it. Now, motivation would only beat out math. In other words, the snowball will only truly beat the avalanche if perfect math never gets done. What does that mean? If you can't keep the avalanche going, the snowball is likely better for you. Now, the question would be how can I save if I have debt? Well, you have to change your mindset rather than always thinking, oh my gosh, I'm in debt. I don't know what to do. Change the mindset if you can towards something like, I am someone who saves money regardless. Now, once debt is defeated, don't revive that beast. You've already set yourself in motion towards financial security or at least debt removal because you changed the percentage from 1 to 3% if you're currently in debt towards buffering yourself towards 3 to 5, 5 to 10%. Debt will no longer be an issue and you won't make it an issue ever again. So now we should come up with a 90-day action plan. Let's say day one, tonight, you come up either with a plan by writing it down, whether it's on your phone, tablet, computer, even something as simple as a notebook. First, you want to list your net income. Again, not your gross. And if you are someone that freelances or uses 1099s, again, take away maximum 30%. If you save more, that's fine. You can just reallocate that money you set aside. You want to list your essentials. You want to open and label accounts, again, such as my emergency fund, my first home fund, my first car fund, my first boat fund, whatever you want to name it. Make sure you have those accounts open and learn, is there supposed to be a minimum to keep the account open? Do you need direct deposit? That's where we can change the percentages. And of course, once you set the automation, whether it's direct deposit or for your savings, again, you can schedule transfers in perpetuity, meaning forever, so long as you have the account. Set 3 to 10% automation every time you get paid. Again, waiting 24 hours is great. Post payment, just in case. Even if it's something small like 20 or $10. You never know. Sometimes, especially with interest, that money can grow. Now, let's say you need to cut costs. How do we target the cost cutting? Well, first you want to kill one money leak. Maybe it's a subscription you forgot. Maybe it's a premium plan you purchased for a reason and you don't use it anymore. Maybe it's an addiction to delivery services. Either way, we want to redirect 100% of that free cash to the first home fund. Again, if you're someone that's not looking to build their first home, but you're looking to get your first car, you just change the name of the fund to whatever the first big purchase is and removing a service you don't use. For example, even if it's overlay, why have both Spotify and YouTube Premium? Pick one and cancel the other. That money over time does help. Now, once you figure out how to cut some costs, especially one major money leak, now in your second to fourth week, in other words, second week to a month, we want to try to add 1% savings automation. If that time frame comes up for the month or 2 weeks, whatever you feel more comfortable with, let's go for 1% more savings automation. Now we could put what's called a thermometer tracker on the wall or in your notes. Of course, again, the lower the temperature is, the worse it would be for us. We want our temperature high, like our body. We don't want it too high, like a fever, because then we might think we can buy something in addition to the fund. Keep it at that beautiful 98.7. Now, month two, remember, that's after the first major cost cutting, and now we're able to establish a good flow of automation for our savings. Now, if the emergency fund isn't where we want it to be yet, we still want to keep the split as lucrative as we can for our needs. One can say 70% house, 30% emergency. Maybe it's 80/20. Find the ratio that works best for you. Now, of course, maybe there's a chance we can do some side income. Now, what do we want to do with side income? Again, after setting aside money for taxes, we want to take that first amount that we make, put a number that you want, whether it's 200, 300, 400, 5, and put it straight into the house fund as a way to build momentum. Now that you're making a little bit money on the side, we can get to our goal a little bit faster. Now, in the third month, we want to have ourselves a nice review, almost like a 90-day review at a job where you finally get out of that annoying probationary period where you're on edge, dotting your I's, crossing your T's everywhere. But we want to now raise that automation after our review another 1 to 3%. The idea is to keep saving money and reduce our expenses any way we can. So you don't want to necessarily destroy or change your budget. You just want to be able to alter your mindset towards making sure you have this amount. Now, of course, when buying a house or any major purchase, you need to have a down payment. Unless your credit rating is so nice that some companies would be okay with a $0 payment because your history is fantastic. However, for a house, you really only need 3 to 5%, even 3.5% as a down payment. You don't necessarily need 10%, 20%. You can actually go into a mortgage calculator and see how much different your monthly expenses would be for mortgage by putting down certain down payments. Of course, the higher the down payment, theoretically, the lower you'd pay a month. But based off of financial calculators, it doesn't necessarily make that big a difference. It might be you're spending more money. Basically, you're spending thousands of dollars up front to pay tens of dollars less a month. It might not be best for you. especially if you can save that money and only put down 3 to 5% on a house. And of course, a moving cushion, which would be a cushion you put for necessities that may need to be new, may be used, or maybe your old current furniture. Or let's say some small repairs. You're gonna need a new microwave, a new toaster. But those items you can always put on a house registry when people come in. They want to offer you gifts as congratulations for buying your first house. But either way, you want to make sure that you have the ability to cover the cost that perhaps others won't buy for you, right? So basically, in 90 days, we have our habits in check. Our balances, especially for savings, are growing. Our stress is lower because our debt is lower. So again, let's get some examples. Let's say you have a friend, or it's you, that has $3,200 net a month, which would be a renter. In other words, they rent a home, whether it's a house or an apartment, and they want to start saving 8%. So 8% of 320 would be 256. Let's say you split it 70-30 now. So you're saving $179 towards your house and 77 towards your emergency. But you're able to cut some subscriptions. Maybe you reduce your Netflix account. You have ads. Maybe you drop the Spotify premium or the YouTube premium. Let's say you're able to cut $60 off monthly. Well, we can now bump that $60 worth of subscription services and now put that to the automation fund. So again, 256 can now go up $60 to 316, but let's round that down. Let's round it up, sorry, to 320. Now after 6 months, you now, because of your savings, you now have $1,900 to your house fund, $800 for an emergency fund, and now your stress is going lower and lower. You're building money. Technically, you have $2,700 in savings. Now, let's say you have a side gig, maybe you're DJing or something, or you're doing some sort of freelance work like dog walking, and now you have $200 a month as a side gig. Now, remember, depending on how much you make, set 30% aside for taxes. But let's just say, for the sake of just this example, you're able to now take that $200 you made off a side gig and put it directly into your house fund. Not necessarily savings or emergency, because you're doing that side gig with a specific purpose. Now, what is our takeaway from this situation? Well, we know that tiny lifts do compound upon each other. We saw that merely saving $256 a month while cutting certain subscriptions that overlap or aren't necessary gave us $2,700 in 6 months. That means we would have saved over 5,000, especially with a sidekick, $6,000 you could have saved in a year. That's a lot of money, especially in today's market. Now, what does that mean? We removed unnecessary expenses and we saved money for a necessary purchase. Now, of course, you can give any other example, but the idea is, how do I reduce my expenditures and increase my income? Number one, discipline. Number two, working towards a goal. Now, of course, what if someone's listening and you say, I can't afford to save? Well, you don't have to save hundreds of dollars per check. It could just be something like $5 to $20. You just want to keep the mindset going. Again, you can get a side gig and just save that money. You can look at each check and say $5 and trade it in your mind. If I reduce it by $5, maybe I'll only get a haircut once every month as opposed to once every 2 months, to take that and save that money. There's always something you can pull from. But you have to identify the pattern of your spending, identify your behavior. That's what you would target to change. Now, what if my bank account makes it so easy through Zelle or PayPal or anything like that to move money? Well, then that's when we go ahead and use bank accounts that take 2 to 3 business days to transfer. That way, you know that you can't just spend what you get immediately. Now, if you have certain banks, they do instant transfers. That's why I mentioned to have the important funds in another bank so that it does take 2 to 3 business days to wire. Now, what if emergencies keep happening? Well, first of all, you might want to find a better way to deal with emergencies rather than just throwing money at it. Learn your patterns again. For example, what happens? Your house is breaking down if you live in your parents' house or wherever. Technically, things aren't always going to happen. If you have an electric car, you know you're not paying money in gas, but now your light bill or your power bill is going to be higher. But if you don't need to go far, then don't get the level 2 charger just for convenience. Get the level 1. Yeah, it's going to take literally days to charge your car as opposed to the convenience of just going to a gas station and pumping your car for like, what, 2 to 3 minutes. But it's all about the money you're saving. You have to be able to go towards the goal. And the only way to go towards the goal is discipline, even if you have emergencies. Well, that's why you have the emergency fund. You don't want to go into debt, though, to be able to fix an emergency because you plugged one hole to create another. Now, what happens if the interest rate changes? Well, hopefully your savings account interest went up. Well, that again depends on your behavior. You cannot change the rates. We don't have the power to change any rates at all, whether we're on, unless we're a part of the Fed, or we're on a bank board and we can determine the rates that are going to be legal. But since you can't control the rates, you can control your behavior. Always find the best possible account for your needs. Now, again, let's go ahead with a few definitions. What does pay yourself first mean? It means save before you spend. What about net income? Oh, that's paycheck amounts after taxes, benefits, and your savings. What about the sinking fund? Well, that's what a bucket is called. A sinking fund is something that is used for a future purchase, and we use that account solely for the future purchase. What about an emergency fund? Well, that's what happens when something terrible happens, like we lose our job or an appliance broke, like your water heater or something like that. That money is used for that oh no moment. And that's why we want to build that emergency fund as much as possible. Again, whether it's you lost your job, lost any income in general, or something terrible happened. Now, what is automation? Automation is when we use technology to do things for us automatically. So that's how we can schedule transfers, again, a day after we get paid, or we can just ask our HR department or our payroll department to split the direct deposit as a percentage for us automatically. And again, what is opportunity cost? Well, that is what we have to give in order to get something. In other words, we can't do two things at the same time. In order to get something, we must first give something up. So now, let's take a look now at our call to action. So, again, tonight, or whenever you see this video, before the end of day, let's set a 2 to 3 or maybe up to 10% automatic transfer to a savings account. And let's name it too. Again, we're trying to buy a house, the first house fund. We're trying to buy a car, first car fund. We're trying to repair our home, whatever that amount of money is going towards, set the name of the account for that, name it appropriately, and allocate from 3 to 10% to that account, either per check or per month. Now, once you realize what percentage you're okay with and you picked up, we want to make sure that you keep yourself excited about it. Keep yourself accountable. Make sure you're always aware how much money you need, how much money you need for that purchase. Can you survive with that 3 to 10%? The answer is always yes, you can. You would just have to pull the money off of somewhere else. All right. Now, with this information that has been shared today, knowing the percentages versus specific dollar amounts, knowing that things do take time to accomplish and it needs your discipline, your desire, and sometimes overcoming our internal struggles. If this information helped you, please hit the subscribe button, like the video, share it with a friend, share it with a coworker that might be struggling, share it with Anybody you know that might need help with financial discipline and know they don't necessarily need $7,000 sometimes immediately. They just need to save towards the amount with percentages and learn how to properly discipline themselves to be able to do things properly financially. But if a friend tells you they can't save, share this video, because every month that they are doing things wrong is another month they won't be able to do things right. And since we're building financial freedom, we can only get there one transfer at a time. And remember, important goals would be to pay yourself first, and of course, name each fund for the purpose of why you are saving.